We know that the sky is blue. We know our mother's name. We know our own names. We know how to get to work. We know how to get to school. Do we ever stop and wonder, how is it that we know what we know? In this presentation, I will try to present what epistemology is, the challenges it has faced, the problems that have been going, and some of the suggested solutions for such problems. How do we know? How do we know that we can know? What is it that we know? Are there any limits to knowing? Is there a threshold for knowledge? What is it that we can be certain of? Who can we trust? Can we trust ourselves? Can we trust others? Can we trust our senses? Is everything just a product of our perception? Or is there a subjective reality that we can refer to? These are some of the questions that epistemology tries to answer. To better understand the task of epistemology, it's good to take a look back. First of all, we're going to start with Descartes, who he developed the cogito. This was the premise of epistemology. He wanted to see what was it that he could doubt. And in that same process, he wanted to see if there was anything that he could know with certainty. His conclusion was that the only thing that he could be sure of was that he was in fact thinking. Anything besides that had to be doubted, as there was no way of confirming or denying its veracity. Descartes is considered by many, and it's often credited as the father of epistemology, because it is his doubt, his methodical doubt, that initiated this movement of what is it that we can know, to what degree, and if there's anything that we can know for sure, if there's any certainty. To do this, we have to focus on perception. If in the search of any objective truth, we're going to see that perception plays an important role. From this, we can talk about idealism, which Descartes was one. Idealism, in simple words, explains that the objects that we see, that the reality that we perceive, is in fact that an idea. It is not an object in itself. It is not an object that is independent from the observer. And then we also have realism, which states that objects are real, that they are not contingent with an observer. So these two ideas play a pivotal role when it comes to perception. Are the objects there? Are they in our mind? Are they independent from us? What is the nature of reality? Are we able to see the world as it is? Can we believe our eyes? Being able to see is a great pleasure in this world that sometimes we don't appreciate how valuable being able to see is. We don't stop and think if our eyes are working correctly. We assume we are looking at the world as it is. But what we look at, is it really there? If we close our eyes, we can no longer see. If we put our hands over our eyes, we cannot see. But we're still conscious about what we see when our eyes are open. If we rub our eyes for long enough, we're going to see that the objects in front of us are going to be duplicated. But we know that there is only one object. We do not assume that there's two objects. We know that it is our eyes that are looking at two different objects, even though it's only one. So there's some philosophers that argue that what we see is just a subjective interpretation of it, and that we don't experience objects directly. This apparent contradiction between the idealist and the realist are just a little piece of evidence that shows us the deeply epistemological problem that exists. We rely or we think that the reality of the physical order is made of perceptual experience. But we have to face uh, some of the challenges that have come up over the last 200 years. One of the first ones um, is subjectivism that arises from idealism. We see that with Locke, we see that with Descartes, where they do a firm separation of primary and secondary qualities of an object. And we can see this as a mistake or as an error because of the acceptance of reality as an abstract concept, which tends to be very convenient in a physical science which has quantitative goals, but without justification when it comes to epistemology. The so-called primary qualities, which are extension, movement in space, inertia, resistance, things like that, that are properties of the physical world. We tend to look at this in regards to numerical precision or some sort of analytical description. A good summary for this would be mathematics. This would include a mathematical way, a mathematical manner of looking at the world. Another error that we can see with Locke and Descartes, it's what it is that they consider knowledge, which comes from a subjective perspective, which is the assumption that they are creating such knowledge from their own perspective. And here from Descartes and from Locke, we can also see how Berkeley um, takes a bold step forward in affirming that these ideas are in fact not abstract, but the realities of perception. Another view on perspective and the senses, we can take it from St. Thomas Aquinas, who he invokes the idea of the intentional, or perhaps we can call it spiritual reception of the sensible form of the object perceived. And this is a big contrast with a more natural way of reception of a form, since this is something that acquires a property by being acted upon. St. Thomas Aquinas would say that while some sensations involve both kinds of the senses, perhaps like touch and taste, for example, um, what is characteristic of all experiences is that it is only possible insofar as the reception is present. He says that external sense cognition is achieved solely by the modification of the sense by the sensible, that would be by the person, by the knower, hence by the form which is impressed by the sensible, or sensation takes place. It should also be noted that for Aquinas, the proper object of awareness are not individuals but forms, or what we could call universals. It is also very pertinent um, to emphasize that a philosopher's interest in perception is not the same as that of a psychologist or a physicist or a chemist, um, or other type of empirical scientist, if we may call them. The philosopher is usually describing perception as an analysis insofar as it is essential to the foundations of knowledge, especially of the external world or the physical objects. So philosophers are interested in the question of what is perceived on the reality of perception, whereas scientists, on the other hand, are interested in how perception takes place, but not the origin. This is clear when it comes to the senses and sense perception, which it's a lot of things that we consider knowledge. As we know, it's almost, I would say, a universal assumption that there is an external world, that there is a physical world, that physical objects exist. But what are the basis for these assumptions, and what is the relation to our sensory information? That would be more of a task of a philosopher, and mainly the task of epistemology. This leads us to another perspective, as redundant as it sounds, on perspective, which I think it is worth exploring, which is like the scientific view, as mentioned before. When we approach perception from an evolutionary standpoint, per se, it's when we are looking for a comprehensive account of man's perceptual resources, so to speak. The evolutionary point of view supports this account by explaining why, for some purposes, we are sensitive instruments, and how we became that way when it comes to our anatomy itself. But it helps us to understand the differences and, more importantly, the limitations of the perceptual capabilities of different organisms, because it seems that the evolutionary point of view has very little to offer to epistemology, even though even though they seem to be concerned with some of the same phenomena. One perhaps one not too good example for this would be uh, a medical doctor uh, having a very strong opinion about the problem of evil based on anatomy alone, which the opinion should not be discarded, but when it comes to epistemology, I think we can agree that it it would not have that much value as it wouldn't help us um, get that far. Having explored a little bit of the scientific perspective on perception, which branches out from some theories of evolution, we have to recognize that even the evolutionary point of view has very little to offer to epistemology, despite the fact that they are concerned with some of the same phenomena. No one expects medical science, for example, to have anything very helpful to say about the traditional problem of evil. This is just one example. If we look for scientific explanations, we have to admit that at best, when it comes to the epistemological problem, this is just a statistical correlation, which to some degree even raises additional problems of how we can view the world and understand it. Well, there's many things that we know better than we did before. This is not saying that we know for sure now, but we do have more tools now. I like to end this with Gallagher from the text and how he says that even though our experiences might be different and perception affects those experiences, he says that even though knowledge is a supremely personal act, it is also an act by which I know myself to participate in an order of universal meaning, which means that even though we have access to knowledge a lot of times at a personal level, that access is what gives us meaning when we know we're part of something of this he calls it human communion. And I believe like he implies in his book that if we are to make any any important advance in epistemology, it is going to be exactly that way, by using the we, by being part of a larger group, and by keep looking for these universals, for this truth, because if it is attainable, I do believe that it is only attainable um, through a we, through a community, and not by ourselves.